back a year ago.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Beer Bound podcast. Today, we're joined by Tony Saylor from Oslo Brewing Company. Oslo Brewing was established in 2015 in Oslo, Norway. Tony acts as the brand manager for his Norwegian craft beer corporation. Along with their operations in Norway, Oslo Brewing owns and operates Ull, a pair of Japanese beer bars dedicated to Scandinavian culture, nature, and fine craft beer, both located in Tokyo, Japan. Very plainly put, Oslo Brewing is made up of a small group of people, all living in and around Oslo, all with a common love for their city. Together with their friends, Oslo Brewing develops the beer they believe in. So let's get into it. We welcome Tony to the Beer Bound podcast. How are you doing, Tony?
Doing great. Thanks for having me today.
We got a bit of a time zone difference, but that's okay. Not stopping us today. Can you go into it a little bit further, Tony? What brought you to Oslo, your connection with beer? Who are you?
Yeah, my story is, long and interesting. American, grew up in small town in Wisconsin, moved to Colorado, lived there for about a decade. And in that period of living in Colorado, I took a solo trip to Iceland, ended up meeting my future wife, who is Norwegian. She was on her way back from the States from work, going back to Norway, and we met at a beer bar in Iceland, did a long distance thing for about a decade, and that's how I ended up in Norway. I was working for a distillery for a handful of years called Breckenridge Distillery in Breckenridge, Colorado, for like I said, a handful of years before I moved here. So I was already in the industry in a way. I was just, in hard spirits and not beer. I mean, the hard spirits like whiskey, bourbon, vodka. I mean, that's just, we make beer and then we distill it further. So it's just taking beer a step further. So it's, I've been in the industry for a while, and it was very exciting to get into beer when I moved here. About 6 months into being in Oslo, I found Oslo Brewing Company. I'm employee 2 officially on the books. There's been Dimitri, who is the CEO, has been there since the beginning with a board of a bunch of friends that are mainly Norwegians that decided to do this project together in 2015. Some other, part-time employees have kind of come and went, but there's only 4 of us now that are on the payroll outside of a few fringe projects, and then the board that helps us go forward from there. So that's where I come from and why I'm here at the moment.
Did you, Tony, have a strong connection with beer prior to your role with Oslo Brewing and before you worked in the alcohol business in general? Was that a part of your life? Did you enjoy beer prior to this? Where did it all begin?
Sure. I've been to college multiple times. I've gone through those ranks, and I've tried all kinds of different beverages of different alcoholic levels. And yeah, I mean, I've always loved that the culture and the fun and friendliness that it comes with, sharing a pint with your buddies. And I grew up with snowboarding and outdoor activities and sports, and what better way to celebrate a good day on the hill than to have a beer or a cocktail afterwards. After a few chairlifts, you're going to get one, and then you get one at the end of the day. And it's always fun. It's kind of been a part of my life since I've been legally able to drink, which is like 18 here, I believe. And some alcohol levels are even a little bit younger. And in the States, of course, where I come from, it's 21.
I mean, craft beer is such a behemoth force in the United States. It really is sort of an American cultural institution in the last few decades. Would you say from living in like Wisconsin to Colorado, would you say those 2 states kind of craft beer or beer in general, the drinking cultures are kind of similar? Are they different?
Sure. I mean, I would say that in general, they are pretty similar. I mean, growing up where I did in Wisconsin, small town, there's not much else to do, especially in the winter. It's super cold. Beer and drinking is a big thing. Some of the major brands, I guess, are coming out of there, like Old Milwaukee Light, or some of these like cheap staples. I believe Pabst Blue Ribbon, I believe, is also Milwaukee, if I'm not mistaken. And then you have like some lesser known things like Hams, and there's an amazing craft brewery called New Glarus, that people should check out if they don't know. One of their most famous beers is called Spotted Cow, and it's like a cow on the label with the farm in the background. That's in the middle of nowhere, Wisconsin. But Colorado, I think, I forgot last time I checked. I mean, maybe it's like 100 plus like craft breweries. I mean, it's insane there. I think they're one of the most dense craft brewing states. And so a lot of great breweries there. Broken Compass Brewery was right across the street from Breckenridge Distillery in Breckenridge. Shout out to them. They're great, and there's plenty of others. And it's been fun to go from one state to the other with all these different great breweries. And I've kind of like, tried all kinds of beers along the way. And it's led me to, yeah, just kind of fall in love with the industry. And that's why I've now been in it for over 8 years running.
Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting. A place like city like Milwaukee comparing to Denver, because I see Milwaukee as a place that has like a really foundational brewing history. I'm a big baseball fan, so if you know the baseball team in Milwaukee, it is the Brewers. Yeah, of course. So you have like those strong, massive institutions that have persisted for 100+ years. And then maybe I see Colorado as more of like a beacon for the craft beer movement a little bit. Just like you mentioned, Colorado is just exploding with craft breweries, and it's really popular. It's kind of woven itself into the culture of like the outdoorsy vibes that Colorado is obviously known for. So that's interesting. That's the United States is such a big, complicated place. So it's kind of interesting to see the different histories and the different connections that your country has with beer. Anyways, so you moved to Oslo, and did you find, tell me about that a little bit in terms of like cultural differences, maybe a little bit about, did you have the ambition to enter into this space again? You had experience working in alcohol, or was it a bit of a coincidence that you ended up working for Oslo Brewing?
It was kind of a mix. I'm a huge outdoors guy and mountaineer. Outside of work, I find myself in the woods, summer, winter, fall, spring. Like I'm always just out and about, either split boarding or hiking and mountaineering and all that. So when I initially came, I figured, yeah, I'm going from Colorado mountain region where I was working at a distillery to a city, but Norway in general is kind of known for their nature and mountains. I was like, maybe I would get into the outdoor industry. Maybe I would leave the industry I was in. I found it pretty difficult to find work here, and culturally, everybody speaks English, but it's not always that simple sometimes, especially with work things. There's a lot of jobs that are run and operated in English, but they do want you in general to know both, and that takes time. I've been here just under 4 years now, and I'm pretty decent at Norwegian, where I don't think it's a barrier to entry anymore for me. But I thought because of the industry I was coming from, that was kind of my ticket in. And so I started sending mails to all the breweries and distilleries that I could find, not really knowing much about the market at the time and how difficult the alcohol industry is here with all of the strict regulations and laws on advertising and everything else. There's not a lot of money to be made. There's not a lot of opportunity, and you kind of have to fill in the holes of people that like come and go from the industry. And there's not like, it's not booming and exploding like in the US, like we were talking about. It took me a little bit of time, but after I got a little while, after about 6 months, I was able to sneak my way into Oslo Brewing Company. We're a very unique brewery, which I can get into in a little bit, or I can just jump right into it now, the type of brewery that we are. So for those that don't know this type of brewing, we're a contract brewery. So we actually don't own our own physical brewery outside of a small 5-gallon roughly or 50-liter tank home system that we do our test batches on. And then we translate that to our partner breweries that actually do the 2,000, 4,000, 8,000 liter plus batches for us. And that is what gets packaged and released onto the marketplace. So This type of brewing, it helps not only us, but the breweries that we're partnering with. We've had multiple partners over the years. We have two currently in Norway and a partner in the United States as well. We've had more in the past, some come and go. As it is tough, there's always capacity to brew more beer at any given brewery at any given time of the day and schedule and week. And because there's so much competition here, these brands have trouble making ends meet, making budget. And so filling the gaps of the time and the tank capacity that they have to invite in another brewery such as ourselves to fill that time and space, they make money. We get that time and space from their brewery. We brew. So we kind of grow as a brand with our partner brands, and it solidifies everybody together in our opportunities in the marketplace. During COVID, this was very beneficial for us as well. Over those couple years that times were tough. We helped in general keep the lights on at some breweries that were struggling because we too were, it kind of raised the level of their production, 100%. We're brewing now about 160,000 liters or so a year. Our current largest partner called Norwegian Bryggeri, so brewery in Norwegian, in Fredrikstad. They're about to approach the 500,000 liter mark, but that is kind of in combination with us. And we also use another brewery called Arendal, which is a fairly large brewery in the kind of southwest of Norway. But nowhere near the major players of the two giants that take up about 85% of the marketplace here. And those names are Hansa and Regnes. So Regnes is in Oslo and Hansa is in Bergen. So kind of the two major cities. Outside of that 85% market share, everybody else is fighting for the other 15%. Outside of Arendal, Mach, Os, all these other breweries that are kind of way below these giants, but bigger than all the micro small craft breweries, which we consider ourselves fighting for kind of the last 2 or 3% of the market that's left in Norway. There's not much space, but our business model is also very green. We believe that, that time and space, the capacity that's in these fermentation tanks systems that otherwise would go unused, we're using that rather than having our own building, our own water supply that we're dumping grain and waste into, which can clog the city system. It's less brewing equipment. Instead of two different breweries doing their business and all the trash, we're combining with one or another, as like a partnership. So it's a green model, we believe, and it's been going well for us so far. But the perception sometimes from the outside in is it your beer? Is it not? It's our recipes. We do test them and solidify them beforehand, and then we have contracts with these breweries, and their brewers execute, and we discuss everything from start to finish.
Yeah, contract brewing is really interesting for me. Like, there's quite a big contract brewing scene in all over North America. That's quite normal here. Now, since you do not have a brick and mortar establishment, can you talk about your outlets, how you actually distribute and sell your product if you don't have a location? Is that easy to do? Are there challenges? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, there are challenges. We're only 6 years old relative. Like I said, we started in 2015, but the first thing we ever did was start a beer bar in Japan called Old Tokyo. And our first 20,000 liters ever produced, it all just went there. So we actually didn't really establish anything here until, the end of 2016, 2017, prior to my time being here. We own a local bar that we're using as a point of sale. But we do own a small office or rent an office space where we work out of. And then we have a large warehouse that houses all kinds of brands, products, and we are just renting space at a giant warehouse where everything from all of our partner breweries gets sent to the warehouse, which is in Moss, which is not far from Fredrikstad, where our biggest partner in Norwegian is at. And then from there, that is our central distribution, and that gets shipped all over Norway and globally. And Oslo is about 45, 50 minutes away from Moss. And it's just per order. So everything for the most part is, on computers and emailing with the systems. And then, physically boots on the ground. We're going from bar to bar, doing mass emails to all the different store chains. There's a few different major players when it comes to stores. There's Norgesgruppen, which means like the Norway group, and then Coop. Those are kind of the two major players that have different levels of grocery store chains underneath that. And the max alcohol volume percentage that you're allowed to sell in grocery stores is 4.7% or less. Anything above that is state regulated and has to be sold at the Vinmonopolet, which is the wine monopoly, which is based that term off of history. And so anything that's Starkle, everything is heavily taxed here as well. So like it's very expensive, and it's a tough industry because it's tough and expensive for the breweries, which then translates to the customer.
Yeah, I bet. I know, like where we live in Toronto, it's very sounds kind of similar. There's some large monopolies that own distribution, and things are starting to change. We can start to see some beer being sold in grocery stores and supermarkets, but it's taking time. It's very regulated, super taxed. So that seems a little bit more similar maybe to the Canadian system as opposed to maybe more of the free market capital system that exists all over the US, would you say?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the US is just a whole other animal. We could never produce the beer that we're selling and marketing in the US in Norway. We couldn't produce it here and ship it over. It's so cost prohibitive with all the taxes and shipping costs and everything like that. So we do have a partner called Beer International, which is run out of New York City, and they also contract with local breweries, and they contract our brand to use and then contract the brand at these breweries there. So we are brewing in the US for the US market. And even that is more expensive than our US counterparts, of course, because there's extra hands involved. But I remember when I was there, I mean, you could get a six pack of super nice craft beer for $6.99. It's probably gone up a little bit now. There's even mix and match packs at some stores where you could grab anything off the shelf, and it ran into like the mid $8 for super great quality beer that you could hand pick your mixer. That just would never exist here, and the price of one beer from a store is almost the price of a six pack back home. They're or two beers. They're about $4 a piece, roughly, which is like 39-40 kroner. And then when it comes to bars and restaurants, they're selling beers for 10, 11, $12 a pint, 110, 120 kroner. I think it's very expensive to have a night out.
Yeah, no way. Norway, by and large, is an expensive country.
Sure.
Definitely. Would you say, Tony, talking about the culture that exists in Oslo, in Norway in general, would you say that this country is a beer loving country? Does it appreciate craft beer in general, or maybe just macro beer? Can you touch on how maybe your experience as a bit of an outsider coming from a big beer loving country like the United States and coming to Norway, what are some similarities and differences that you see in maybe consumer trends?
Absolutely. And this is definitely part subjective, part objective, take on this. From what I've seen, from what I've read, be it in the industry, scouring the internet, in general, this is a very Pilsner lager country. It needs to be cheap, easy to drink, or cheap enough so I can have a ton of them. And the craft beer scene has been a challenge, and it really is only taken off since 2010 and beyond, roughly. Nugne is one of the first like craft beer brands from the early 2000s that actually blew up and kind of made it, and then got gobbled up by one of the major players, and now they're producing it, and now it's a craft beer brand, but it's part of the larger portfolio of I believe that was Ringnes. And so craft beer has a time and place, it has a market, but a lot of breweries, especially from COVID, they're shutting their doors. One of our partners, St. Halvard's Bryggeri, they're in Oslo. We were brewing in Oslo with them, and they just couldn't make it work. They were kind of struggling for a long time, and then eventually they just can't financially make it work. Craft beer, people do love it here, but it's hard to get that into the store. And then once it's in the store, for a person to go out of their way, more or less, to try the new thing because it is so expensive. People kind of like, I know what I like, I know what I want. Creatures of habit, kind of, from what I see, is that like, oh, I'll grab the Pilsner that I know and just take a 6-pack and be on with my way. But there are a decent amount of craft breweries that are trying to make it work. Yeah, I think people do like it and are excited about it, but it takes longer here to get established, and we're still very young.
Being a contract brewery, I'm sure you know, has probably its positives and its negatives. I think some contract breweries that I'm familiar with, I know that they're very comfortable in that space and that's their identity, and their identity is wrapped around being a contract brewery. They don't want a brick and mortar establishment. That's just who they are. And I think some see that as a stepping stone into, we'll become a contract brewery and eventually get our own space down the road. Which one do you think Oslo Brewing fits into? Is it more of contract brewery forever, or maybe having a location at some point?
I think that's a good question from our perspective, and my perspective of how we're running things now is, when I first started, I thought that the mission was going to be that we would do this until we were making enough money to potentially open up our own brewery. We did own a very small system. This is before my time. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was a 300-liter system that we eventually sold to a bar brewery combo called Brig. And Brig is like brew in Norwegian. And that was in Oslo. I think we're going to stick as just a contract brewery from here on out, and we are happy with that and that model. And if we decided to go brick and mortar, I think we would fail like some of our partners in the past. I think financially, it just does not work at this time for us. And our perception is that I don't think it's going to work for a very long time, but that could change. It just depends. But we're leaning towards contract for life.
Now, I see some positives to what you're doing in your ability, it seems like, to send your product very internationally. So can you tell us about where one can find Oslo beer in the world?
So from my understanding in the US, and this is kind of an ongoing, it moves back and forth. We have a partnership currently that was signed with Distill Brewery in Normal, Illinois, and they were going to help us try to get into 38 states in distribution. In that scenario, I don't think we've gotten distributed that far. We're kind of in a handful of places, and there's no system for like where and how you would get our beer there, unfortunately. Through Beer International, our partner that's in New York, they have links to a Shopify, I believe, system that goes with Taproom, and it's connected where a couple of our beers that are there can be shipped to different locations depending on where we're allowed to sell. So it's kind of more of some bars in Rhode Island, because that's where Dimitri, our CEO, is from. So he goes back there every year and is boots on the ground. So Rhode Island, the smallest state in the US, we have the biggest following of any of the other states. And then we're just kind of scattered a little bit here and there at some bars in New York City and whatnot. We're in Iceland with a few of our beers. We've been there for a handful of years, mostly in Reykjavik, which is the capital there. There's not much going on outside of Reykjavik. I've been there a handful of times. It's where I met the wife. That's my story, and so I have a connection to Iceland. It's dear to my heart. We're in Finland and in Sweden. We win some tenders, they're called, like where different state regulators or organizations put out like feelers for, if you win this, then you get this many amount of liters contracted that we distribute for you and go here and here. So we've won a couple tenders in Sweden and Finland. Owning 2 bars in Japan, we send massive amounts of beer to Japan. We also have a very strong connection to Taiwan. So one of my colleagues, Jeff, is part American, part Taiwanese. He's gotten us into all of the 7-Elevens, which is a huge deal. We are decently, we're all over Taiwan, a little bit in China. We're looking to send we've sent shipping containers full of beer to China before. And with partnerships like 7-Eleven and Taiwan, separate from China, we're sending a lot of product to East Asia. And here and there, we have a couple of Dutch interns that work for us now. So we're trying to break into the market in Holland, in the Netherlands. We're always aspiring to be everywhere. Scandinavia is our hub. And then East Asia, Japan, and Taiwan, super strong players. We own bars there. And then, sparsely kind of like here and there in the US. And that's more or less where we're at.
How difficult is this? I know I've had a few conversations with different brewery owners about, I mean, you send your beer all over the world, and it's not such an easy product to ship. You're shipping basically water with some other ingredients into it all across the world, and that's very heavy. Is that a difficult, I guess in conversations that I've had with a few other brewery owners, that there was this ambition to really have a brewery that's creating their product, like a contract brewery or a contract with a brewery in a location in order to make their product, just because that works a lot better logistically, instead of making a ton of beer in Oslo and sending it all the way to Japan, which I think is crazy. I mean, crazy cool, not crazy.
I know what you mean, man.
Yeah, like
no offense taken.
Yeah. No, it's just so must be such a logistical endeavor. Would I be correct in that?
Yeah, 100%. So the thing is with us, we did do one small contract brew for a collaboration we did with a local street artist that travels all over the world and does murals. His name is Martin Watson. That was a fun project. We did a contract brew in Japan for a small batch release, artwork, beer combo. Only the first like 50, 100 attendees got the artwork with the beer, and it was kind of a thing. But for the most part, our business model really is, we believe that Norway has some of the best, cleanest, water in the world, and water is the main ingredient of beer. And I think that, sometimes around the world, people can put certain water on a pedestal, and like we lose that if we don't brew in Norway with Norwegian water. So to me, it's such a core of the business. It's worth the extra cost to brew here and send overseas. We do have to really penny pinch when it comes to our partners in Taiwan, like 7-Eleven, for instance. Global chain, everybody knows. I think it's the most common store around the world, anywhere. I think it's the number one. There's the most amount of boutiques. So they have a price point that they need to hit for their customers' expectations. And we have to dig into our margin super deep to be able to still brew here, ship it there, get it to a price point that 7-Eleven will accept. And, we're doing huge volumes there, but I'm not going to say we're making a ton of money. It's more, it's very good branding for us, and it's great marketing, and it's worth it. But it's expensive, and it takes a month or two to get over there in general. It's usually by boat. So that's the other thing too. So the best before dates, that can be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're kind of forced to put longer best before dates. And then the beer, are we being honest with how fresh it is? I mean, we're putting proper dates, but it's like, if it takes 2 months to get there, sometimes super hoppy New England IPAs, they're best fresh. So it's like you kind of lose that window of time with beer like that. But we've been trying to send mainly cans there because that holds better. We've sent a lot of bottles in the past, but we're kind of going away from trying to send too much glass that direction, just because they're sealed with a with a bottle cap. But there's more potential for oxygen to get in for issues with oxidation, and so like that it might not taste as good. So cans are better, safer.
Mm-hmm.
Glass breaks as well on a boat in the ocean for months.
Of course. Yeah. It actually, that reminds me of why we have the IPA in the first place, sending British ale all the way around the Horn of Africa to reach India. And why it's so hoppy is because it is a natural preservative, and that helped it stay fresh in order to reach the British soldiers stationed in India. Very interesting. Do you see, Tony, as your brand being, I mean, it is so connected with Oslo, the largest city in Norway. How far do you lean into that in terms of your branding? How do you connect this particular city with your identity?
Sure. I mean, it's such a large part of what we do. I mean, I'm wearing the sweater with the logo here now. So the joke that I've heard, even before, I kind of moved here now that I'm here is that Norway's getting more and more known as its own thing, but it was kind of known as Sweden's little brother for a long time, from like kind of the rolling joke. And people are like, what is like Oslo? Like it wasn't really on the map as a city. Like people know Stockholm, but like that's changing. Oslo's getting a lot bigger, a lot of growth, a lot of international influx, a lot of big businesses are coming here, and it's starting to become the place to be, almost in Scandinavia in general. The reason we chose this name, I mean, it's crazy to the founding partners. Again, a few years before I started, I've been here about half the time the company exists, roughly. Is that they couldn't believe that no brewery, no company was like, we're Oslo Brewing, or nobody's used the name. Everybody's like, I'm Hansa, I'm Rignes, I'm Amundsen, I'm Neusum. Like they all had names of the person's last name, some kind of just Norwegian tie of something. Nobody was using the largest city, the capital, as a name. So we're like, well, we need to do that. We're going to be Oslo Brewing, and we lean into that with one thing that we're doing to promote the city and to try to help put Norway on the map even further is we use these little things we call fun facts that we put a little bit of information, a fun note on the city and like, things to do and whatnot. So you can read a little bit about Oslo on any given bottle or can that we're producing. And that's helping just spread the awareness of like, hey, this is a fun place. Visit and drink our beer.
Maybe on like a personal note, Tony, just because I'm interested. My wife, she's from South America, so I have an international marriage as well. Is it difficult at all for you living in Norway, a different country? Do you find you still have a little bit of culture shock? Did you ever have any culture shock? What are some big differences you see? It doesn't have to be necessarily in the brewing world that you encounter. What are some of the big differences in a city like Oslo compared to Wisconsin or Denver even, or Colorado rather? Do you feel like Norway is now your home? You don't really encounter very many cultural differences, or do you still run into some little speed bumps here and there?
Yeah, I feel like I do. It's definitely a mixed bag for me. I mean, I grew up in a very small town in nowhere, Wisconsin, of under 4,000 people. Then I lived in Denver for a handful of years, which is, a couple million. And then I was in Breckenridge in the mountains, which is more or less like even smaller than my hometown. That was only a couple thousand. And that's a very transient area, Summit County. And most people can't afford to live there year round. It's a nature hub, skiing, snowboarding, winter, wonderland, paradise. And then for the most part, there's people with their vacation homes, they pack up and go. So the summers, although it's beautiful and you can go hiking and stuff, like the work kind of can fade with the tourism a little bit. So I've seen, small, medium, large cities in the US. And then moving here, Oslo is way smaller than Denver. It's I think somewhere around 600,000 or so, maybe or less people in Oslo. It's very international, unlike Denver. In my opinion. I mean, I'm sure there is some of that. There's like some South American influence coming into the city, the South of America in general. There's a little more of that going on in Arizona, Texas, Colorado. A lot of like great Hispanic food. Like I love living in Denver because I'm a huge taco burrito like fan. I love spicy food. I like sour beers. I like spicy food. Like my palate likes the extremes. But yeah, I mean, the culture here with the language you can get by with English, but like having all these foreign languages, not just Norwegian. I mean, people are speaking Swedish, Dutch, German, Russian. I mean, it's always something going past my ear that I'm just like, oh, what are they saying? What are they saying? And as far as like weather goes, it's actually way colder back home in Wisconsin than it ever is here. It surprised me how warm it is here in general on the year. I mean, today it's minus, I think like 11 Celsius, which ends up being in the teens. So it is cold, but like that's kind of around the limit. Back home, it used to get to minus 30, 40 Fahrenheit. And it was just, they would cancel school. You couldn't go outside. It was crazy. But I've encountered just different things that have, turned me on and off. In general, the culture is very welcoming for the most part. I just had a daughter. She turned 1 a few weeks ago, but the system here is you get 3+ months paid off as a father, and then the wife or woman or whatever your domestic partnership situation looks like to be PC. The other person gets like 8 to 9 months. In general, you split a year between the two of you, and I took the 3 month minimum, and the wife took the rest. It's incredible that that exists. So you have one of the paternal parents that's with the kid for a full year before you send them off to local daycare. And back in the US, I mean, you're lucky to get your 2 weeks to get back to work or you're fired. There's a lot more caring here. The healthcare system, if I break my leg, it's covered. If I get seriously ill, it's very small amounts. I think the max is like just over 2,000 kroner. So it's like $250. It's like kind of your max bill on the year. And then everything after that's kind of covered by the state. Education is more or less free. I've already gotten my master's back in the States, and I'm still very deep in debt from that. And that just doesn't exist here. There's a lot of good things. The social safety nets are incredible.
I know that the Scandinavian countries like Sweden or Norway, they get a lot of praise from some folks around the world for being such a perfect example of having a large safety net, having large social programs, and being a very prosperous and wealthy and safe country. So sort of a beacon of that type of government and this type of system. Now, you work for a private company in a private business in Oslo. Do you find that Norway, maybe compared to the United States, but not necessarily, just its identity as well, do you find it I think you alluded this a little bit in terms of regulations and red tape and bureaucracy. Do you find it a easy place to conduct business, or things can be a little bit challenging sometimes?
In this industry, it's definitely a lot more challenging. You can't market alcohol at all, social media, or there's no billboards. Like in the US, you got Miller Lite, Budweiser, like they have billboards all over everywhere. Super Bowl commercials, or whatever, like just commercials all in between every show. There's almost more commercials than there is content in the show nowadays. It's gotten more and more leaning towards, like follow the money. But that doesn't exist here. They're trying to promote, I guess, in general, healthy lifestyles. Drug companies can't promote, aspirin, Tylenol, or whatever, like the versions of whatever these things are for whatever they're claiming they're going to cure and make your life better. There's none of that is allowed. No influence, like gambling, there's no gambling ads, things like that. We're able to skirt the rules a tiny bit on social media because we own 2 bars in Japan, and we're also brewing in the US as well with our partner there, that we can always kind of say available for export or on the way to Japan for our partner, as long as you're not clearly promoting where, how, and when within Norway this specific product is going to be, and being it's delicious and juicy. You can't use these buzzwords. Even with the wine monopoly, which is the government control of any alcohol over 4.7%, when I send them an advertisement for them to post internally only, I'm only allowed to say what the basic ingredients are and a picture, and that's about it. I can't embellish at all and be like, oh, this amazing, juicy, triple hopped IPA is gushing with flavor. Any of those buzzwords, it's no, you're promoting drinking illegal, or we're not going to post this. Yeah, you have to change it to just tell us what it is, and our store managers will decide if they care it's good enough to put it in their store or not. And it's tough.
Do you see some pushback with that in terms of maybe craft breweries or distillers, alcohol companies in general? Do you see a bit of a shift in some liberalization in content being allowed to be distributed, or Norway's pretty much stuck in its ways that beer is alcohol, it's not really a social good, we want to kind of put it to the side and we want to restrict it in many ways? Are things opening up a little bit, or maybe closing more and more? What does that look like from you?
So my perception is that in general, this is so historically established and ingrained and accepted that they don't get a lot of pushback. I think you can kind of see both sides. That if it was open season for everybody to just put their billboards up. Only the major players like Rygness and Hense that cover kind of 85% of the market would have the money to actually push all of that out there so much that maybe it would suppress small breweries even more, because there's nothing really much for us more to give. That little bit of extra money that we make that keeps our lights on, if we push that into marketing to try to also have a billboard or have ads, we just don't have that capital to utilize. So the fact that these giants can't market their stuff either, I think levels the playing field a little bit more for the little guy. So in my opinion, I think we welcome it from our side of things as a contract brewery at the size we are. And I'm not so sure it's going to change anytime soon. There's really no incentive for the government to at some point allow promoting drugs, alcohol, sex, gambling. I mean, all of that kind of is bundled into not like sinful behavior or anything like that, but it is a very Christian nation, depending on where you're at. And there's levels of that too. It's an interesting place to be. And like the international flux that's coming in, especially in Oslo, a lot of outside influences coming in a good way, and trying to, like loosen things up. But I think when it comes to alcohol and drugs, whether, they're just for, cancer or whatever, like there's no incentive for them to allow that to be a money maker and for giant corporations to advertise, because usually it's about the money and not about helping people in general, from what I've seen, at least in the US.
Well, you talked a little bit about being creative and doing some content creation that kind of goes around the rules a little bit, being an international product. Can you talk a little bit about how some other creative ways that you sort of promote yourself and pronounce your identity to the city of Oslo, the whole country? How do you, with these rules and regulations and restrictions, how do you get the word out about who you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. One of the few things we can kind of do is to have local events and be a part of the festivals that are going on, whether we're one of the major players or just another brewery or supplier. We were just at this large festival called Et Glass, which in Norwegian means like one glass. They gave everybody like a glass when you come in, and there was breweries, there was distilleries, there was wineries, everything was there, and you use that glass and you have like so much money in your account, and you kind of like try whatever you want for a set amount of hours, and then the next wave of people would come in. But just kind of taking advantage of any events that do happen. And COVID was a problem with that, because most events were canceled or they were restricted capacity and things like that. A problem even with the events when you land them. You're not allowed to even, like on Facebook, there's the event header that's in, the event page. You can't put your logo. Like we can't have our logo there. It has to be, an evening with Oslo Brewing Company. We have to like write words. It's just like, we're there, but we can't use our logo because that's like promoting alcoholism and selling. So the events we can do, we do, and we have to tread lightly with the marketing and branding of that. And hopefully people, word of mouth, find out about these things, partnering with local artists like Martin Watson, the street artist, attaching ourselves to cultural identities he's from Oslo, in worlds that we're not really a part of, like art. If somebody likes him and then his art's on our beer, maybe they hear about us from that. And then from there, they tell their friends. I mean, it's just very kind of word of mouth, because you're not really allowed to advertise, anywhere. It's tough. So just being a part of festivals and partnering with local anyone, artists.
Community folk.
We did a local donut shop. We did like a donut IPA. We put a bunch of her donuts, and she has her own story coming from Australia. Her name is Taylor. Her company is Taylor Made. Makes really cool, crazy, funky donuts. She's lived here for a while. So she has a huge cult following. So like other local craft places or artists that have their own followings, we kind of like team up. Like we're partners with Fulin, the coffee roastery, which helps or owns part of the bars in Japan with us, because Fulin has coffee bars in Japan as well, outside of the old Tokyo concepts. And so doing partnerships and events, we had a Cascara IPA collab with them. And Cascara, if you don't know, is the outer shell of a coffee bean. that historically in general, other than maybe in the countries that they would grow it, they would make tea and stuff out of it, but it would kind of just be discarded waste, because importers were just like, oh, we just want your coffee beans. That's all we want. But cascara is part of a coffee bean. It's the outside shell that the bean is in. So drying that is called cascara, and people make tea. There's a little bit of caffeine in that too, and now places like Fulin and stuff like that are actually selling the cascara as well, because like, why just throw it away? And it's becoming more of a trend. So we use those coffee shell clippings to make an IPA, and like we try to do fun, unique things with local partners that have their own followings, and that's kind of all we can do.
Tony, do you have a preferred beer that Oslo Brewing creates? What's your favorite style of beer?
Yeah, for me, I really enjoy, and this can be a tough one for some, because dark, heavy beers can be, you can only really have one, before you have to move on to something else. But our Dream Porter is one of our first major beers that kind of like hit it. It's a 6.5% beer based off of our initial brewer that started and was one of the kind of the founders with the initial board members, who has since left us. But he's part Icelandic, and he based it off of a candy bar called Dramir, which is an Icelandic chocolate and licorice mix. I, for one, do not like black licorice. I hate licorice, but that candy is somehow amazing, and that beer is amazing. So I've grown to love it, but I would never eat licorice on its own. I think maybe my connection to Iceland with my wife and everything too, I'm a little more roped in with that experience. And so for me, it's a little nostalgia, but it's a super tasty chocolate. The licorice is super subtle. You don't really taste it. It's just a good light porter, in my opinion. It's not super thick. And so you can drink it. I feel like I can have a whole one and still feel good. So that's kind of my favorite beer that we make. And that is only available in a bottle. And we've done some stronger versions in a can where we added chipotle and raspberry, and we called it the Imperial Dream Porter. So we've done like level up versions of it, but the Dream Porter original is on our line still today. And you can find that across Norway.
When are you sending beer to Canada, Tony?
I mean, it's always on our radar to infiltrate or find new markets. So I wonder if Beer International, our partner in New York City, I don't know what their ties would be to having any level of distribution in Canada, but they're not far across the border, I would think, from Toronto, right? New York
No, we're not
City
too far.
Isn't far.
Yeah, our province, though, particularly, like each province has their own rules. It's kind of like the United States in that way. And our province, Ontario, is not very open to international sales of beer, which kind of sucks. We're very, it's a lot of rules and regulation and restriction, and domestic product is kind of reigns supreme, which has its bonuses, but then you also miss out on all the wonderful craft beer that even exists right across the border in New York State or in Michigan even.
Yeah, for me, I mean, the only way we could probably do it then with what you're saying is to contract from a brewery within your province. But then it's like, it's kind of cost prohibitive. You're adding these extra layers and cost to the consumer. And yeah, it would be our recipe. It would be unique. You get our branding and it is fun. But technically it would be, Canadian water
right,
upsold back to you at a extravagant price. So I don't know if it's really going to fly at this time.
An excuse for me to go to Norway, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Tony,
you're
welcome anytime.
Wonderful. Tony, we're coming up on our hour mark, so I want to, of course, be respectful of your time. I like to typically end with a little bit of predictions on the future, just your sense of beer and craft beer and brewing in Norway. Are you optimistic on the growth of this particular industry? Do you have some knowledge or insight on, or ideas rather, of how this industry is moving forward? I know we're kind of coming off of the wave of 2 years of a global pandemic, which obviously has hit every industry quite hard. I assume Norway, like most other countries in the world, is going through some form of inflation, I suspect, and that affects everyone. How do you see craft beer, craft breweries, this cultural phenomenon expanding in the next, say, 5-10 years? Do you see growth potential? Do you see amalgamation? Do you see a complete wipeout, a destruction of the industry? What are your thoughts on the future?
Yeah, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. Just like any and all businesses, you always strive to have some level and percentage of growth increase from one year to the next. We have been steadily growing every year. We've never gone down in production. So as far as our term goes, we believe that we're still going to be here in 5-10+ years, especially with the contract brewing model. We believe we have a little less risk, a little less overhead. Yeah, we do pay a little bit of a premium when it comes to ingredients and renting that time and space, but that's saved by not having our own brick and mortar operation. I would say that unfortunately, we're going to see some of the other smaller craft breweries. They're going to be cannibalized. The ones that some of the major players maybe believe that their brand image is strong enough to gobble up and then just produce and keep replicating as a kind of a shell brewery for them. Some are just going to disappear completely just because they're not picked up and their branding isn't strong enough for one reason or another. I believe I just learned that there's I think Father is a brewery that was, I believe it was Mother and Son or something like that. They're about to close their doors and go on to another path. Prices are increasing next year from the government. The tax per liter is going up based off of, you do get tax breaks depending on what level of brewery you're at, 50,000 liter, 100,000, 200,000. Once you hit that 500,000 liter mark or beyond, there's zero tax breaks. And so the incentive to go from, 499,000 liters to 501 is very small. It's kind of incentivized to stay small unless you're already a major player. And like you said, inflation, I mean, the prices are going up. The government wants a bigger piece of that pie. That's going to translate to the beer price on the shelves, as well as, bread, milk, cheese, butter, all the other things. So, it remains to be seen what's going to happen when it comes to, people have to make choices like, do I eat or do I have a beer? That's more joking, but yeah, I mean, consumers are going to have to make that shift in their head, like, hey, do I have this disposable income or not? And times are getting tougher globally. So yeah, I do believe, to kind of sum up, that we're still going to be around, but I think there's going to be a consolidation. Other breweries are going to disappear, some are going to get gobbled up, and yeah, it's kind of getting more homogenous. Like kind of the major players, the big get bigger, and but we'll see. There's always going to be some level of craft brewery life here, and we'll see what happens. Maybe we'll do this again in 4 or 5 years. You'll have me back on, and we can talk about where we're at and where the industry's at then.
I would love that. That sounds like a plan. Well, thank you so much, Tony. Tony Saylor from Oslo Brewing Company in beautiful Oslo, Norway. I will definitely, I've had the fortune of traveling to Europe quite a bit, particularly recently, and I've never been to Norway, but it's definitely on the list. And if I ever do, I'll let you know and we'll have a pint together, and definitely have you on in a few years to see how your predictions have played out. Would love that. Sure. So Tony Saylor from Oslo Brewing Co., thank you, sir, and look forward to chatting again soon.
Yes. Thanks. Thanks for listening, everybody. Cheers. See you next time.
Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all our interviews and beer-related content. Remember, craft beer is here.